Ghost in the Carbon Chapter 1, The Equation of Prey. Commander Caithrax of the S'valian 3rd Expansion Fleet did not believe in ghosts. To him, the universe was not a place of mystery, spiritual echoes, or unexplainable phenomena. It was a vast, cold equation composed entirely of predictable physical data. He placed his absolute faith in the unyielding reliability of multispectrum thermal signatures, the mathematical certainty of kinetic energy yields, and the clinical perfection of S'valian military doctrine. For 2 centuries, this rigid adherence to quantifiable facts had served him well. It had seen him through the subjugation of the gas dwellers of Jupiter 4, the glassing of the agrarian moons of the Outer Rim, and the systemic dismantling of a dozen lesser species who had mistaken their own artistic or spiritual achievements for tactical viability. As his massive flagship, the Scourge of Viridia, cast its immense, jagged shadow over the drifting human freighter, Caithrax felt absolutely nothing but the familiar, numbing boredom of an apex predator observing a terminal animal. He sat upon his command dais, his 4 upper mandibles twitching rhythmically as he reviewed the scrolling green data on his primary ocular overlay. The target was a vessel named the Lowly Wanderer. To Caithrax's highly refined aesthetic sensibilities, the human ship was not an achievement of engineering, but an architectural insult. It was a Class C heavy ore hauler, a bloated, asymmetrical cylinder of unpolished hull plating that looked less like a starship and more like a collection of industrial scrap, salvaged from a planetary junkyard and welded together in a desperate hurry. Thick ribbons of dark carbon scoring marred its flank, the scars of poorly shielded micrometeoroid impacts. Its sublight engines sputtered with an uneven, arrhythmic pulse, spitting out dirty ion trails that suggested a completely degraded magnetic containment field. Yet, inexplicably, this miserable ghost ship sat deep within the Perseus arm. This was a lawless, highly volatile sector of space where the S'valian Hegemony was currently conducting aggressive territorial expansion, a place where no civilian vessel, let alone a primitive human cargo barge, should ever dare to venture. "Commander," the secondary sensor officer hissed from the lower pit, its posture hunched in submission. "The subspatial scan of the civilian target is complete. Data is locked." Caithrax did not turn his elongated head. "Read the biological signatures into the log, sub-officer." "The vessel contains an remarkably small crew, Commander. Only 7 distinct biological signatures are active within the primary atmospheric envelope. Their internal technology is entirely primitive, relying on localized copper alloy wiring, mechanical relays, and a highly inefficient fission matrix auxiliary core. Furthermore, their biology is laughably fragile. Our database categorizes them as soft-bodied, hairless bipeds from the 3rd planet of the Sol system. They possess no natural chitinous armor, no venom glands, and no secondary respiratory systems. They long ago traded their natural claws and muscular density for primitive calculators and automated climate control. They are remarkably susceptible to localized atmospheric pressure shifts and minor radiation exposure. Caithrax let out a low, clicking rumble from his chest, the S'valian equivalent of a dismissive chuckle. "Deathwelders," he murmured, spitting the word out like a foul piece of meat. The galactic intelligence reports from the frontier border skirmishes speak of them with an absurd amount of superstitious reverence. They claim the species possesses a psychological resilience that defies standard pacification models. They call them stubborn, unpredictable. "Sensors indicate only fear, Commander," the sub-officer replied, its mandibles curling in amusement. "Their internal heart rates are elevated by 40% above their species baseline. Their localized comms network is flooded with panicked, unencrypted audio transmissions begging for assistance from their distant orbital sector command. Assistance that is at least 12 light-years away. Kaithrax stood up from his dais, his long, heavy tail sweeping across the polished deck plates with a sharp, metallic hiss. He adjusted the ceremonial standard pinned to his shoulder armor, a heavy piece of polished obsidian that marked his lineage within the high caste of the expansion. "We will not waste the primary plasma batteries on this debris," Kaithrax commanded, his voice echoing through the vast, quiet command deck. "Order the third boarding party to initiate standard breach protocols. It has been 3 solar cycles since our young warriors have drawn blood. They grow soft on a diet of automated target simulations and synthetic rations. We will use this wretched human vessel to blood the new vanguard. Let them understand what it means to hunt an inferior species in the flesh. I want the vessel cleared methodically, room by room, corridor by corridor. Bring me the ship's log and erase the rest." "And the survivors, Commander." Kaithrax turned his cold, lidless eyes toward the viewscreen, where the lowly wanderer floated like a dead whale in the starless void. "The humans will offer no more meaningful resistance than a field of tall grass against a mechanical scythe. If any survive the initial breach, throw them into the primary atmospheric collectors. Our engines require fresh organic matter to balance the fuel scrubbers." Chapter 2, The Breach at Airlock 3. The S'valian boarding pods did not slide into place. They struck the lowly wanderer like heavy kinetic javelins. Built from thick, reinforced, depleted alloys, the pods were designed to punch directly through a civilian ship's outer hull layers, deploying automated magnetic seals within milliseconds of impact to prevent explosive decompression. Inside Pod 3, 2nd Vanguard Veilka braced his 4 lower arms against the hydraulic dampening bars. His heavy, matte black power armor hummed with a deep, reassuring vibration, the internal nuclear battery feeding a constant stream of tactical data directly into his neural implant. Veilka was young, his carapace still a light, unhardened shade of green beneath his armor, but his heart beat with the fierce, aggressive pride of his warrior caste. He had spent his entire youth in the brutal military academies of S'valian Prime, mastering the arts of close-quarters room clearing and high-intensity urban pacification. To him, this mission was not a battle, it was an exercise, a live-fire graduation ceremony. A deafening, metallic shriek echoed through the pod as the automated drill bits tore through the human ship's secondary bulkheads. A brilliant green light flashed twice on Veilka's helmet display, indicating a successful seal and a stable, breathable oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere on the other side. "Blades out, warriors," Veilka bellowed through the localized squad channel, his voice modulated by his helmet's external speakers to sound like a terrifying, mechanical roar. "The commander watches our performance from the high deck. Remember your training, move with speed, strike without mercy. The Empire grows on the bones of the weak." The heavy forward blast doors of the boarding pod slammed outward, collapsing onto the floor of the lowly wanderer with a resonant, ringing boom. A thick cloud of white condensation and stale, humid air rushed into the pod, smelling faintly of old machine oil, rusted iron, and the unmistakable sweet scent of mammalian sweat. Veilka was the first to step out onto the human ship. His heavy, magnetic boots left deep, distinct indentations in the thick layer of grime and soot that covered the deck plates. Immediately, his multi-spectrum visor went to work, painting the pitch-black corridor in a crisp, hyper-detailed artificial green light. Every scratch on the wall, every exposed bundle of hydraulic hoses, and every microscopic dust mote dancing in the humid air was perfectly mapped, categorized, and displayed on his tactical HUD. "Clear," the warrior behind him, Tiren, hissed, stepping out with his heavy plasma rifle held at the low-ready position. "Sensors show no active traps, No defensive turrets. The primary corridor is completely undefended. The 5 S'valian warriors of Pod 3 moved forward in a textbook tactical diamond formation. Their heavy, reinforced armor plates clicked and scraped against the narrow, claustrophobic walls of the human freighter. To a species accustomed to the vast, vaulted ceilings of S'valian architecture, the lowly wanderer felt less like a starship and more like a subterranean tunnel. The ceiling was low, forcing the taller warriors to hunch their shoulders, and the air was thick, heavy, and uncomfortably warm. Veilka glanced at his internal map overlay. The automated subspatial scan from the Scourge of Viridia had provided them with a basic, three-dimensional layout of the ship's primary arterial corridors. Their objective was simple: advance down the secondary spine, secure the secondary engineering substations, and converge with pods 1 and 2 at the primary galley, where the remaining human heat signatures were currently huddling together like terrified livestock. "Look at this primitive filth," Tiren muttered through the comms, kicking a rusted manual wrench that lay on the deck. "They use manual hydraulic valves to regulate their atmospheric pressure. No neural networks, no biosynthetic overrides. It is a miracle this vessel did not collapse under its own structural mass before it left their home system." "Do not let your arrogance cloud your vision, Tiren," Veilka cautioned, though he privately shared his subordinates' absolute disdain. "The human animal is weak, but a cornered beast can still scratch. Keep your eyes on the thermal overlays." The squad advanced 40 meters down the corridor, their multispectrum visors tracking the faint, residual heat signatures left behind by the human crew hours prior. The glowing, orange footprints on the floor led straight toward the core of the ship. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the tactical simulation. It was effortless. Then, the ship's environment began to fight back. It did not start with an explosion or an ambush. It started with a low, rhythmic thrumming sound that vibrated deeply through the floor plates, a sound that didn't come from the ship's engines, but from its structural skeleton. Veilka stopped, raising a single upper hand to signal his squad to halt. "Report, did anyone else detect that structural vibration?" Before Tiren could answer, a loud, sharp clack echoed through the walls, followed immediately by the sound of heavy pneumatic cylinders firing in rapid succession. Every single light fixture along the length of the corridor did not merely flicker or dim. They were manually and completely shunted into a total blackout. The faint, ambient hum of the ship's primary ventilation system died instantly, replaced by a suffocating, absolute silence. "Halt, defensive posture," Veilka commanded, his secondary arms instinctively reaching for the backup power cells on his waist. "Switch visors to passive night vision. Activate internal armor floodlights." The warriors clicked their helmet controls, but the darkness that greeted them did not yield to their advanced technology. The passive night vision overlays flared with a violent wave of green static, unable to find even a single photon of ambient light to amplify. When Veilka forced his high-intensity external armor lights to activate, the beams of brilliant white light extended less than 2 meters before being utterly choked out by a thick, white wall of freezing fog. "Report," Veilka barked, his heart rate spiking as his HUD began to flash a series of amber warning flags. "What is this substance? My sensors are malfunctioning." "Liquid nitrogen," Tiren yelled, his voice losing its arrogant edge. "And high-pressure industrial steam. Someone has manually ruptured the primary coolant lines, and environmental regulation blocks directly into the ventilation shafts. The ambient temperature is dropping through the floor. It's down to -40 degrees and falling." Veilka looked down at his primary tactical display, and a cold spear of genuine dread shot through his chest. The advanced multi-spectrum visors that were the pride of the S'valian military The tools that allowed them to see through walls, track heartbeats, and map alien environments with absolute certainty were suddenly completely useless. The chaotic, swirling mixture of sub-zero liquid nitrogen and boiling, high-pressure steam had turned the narrow corridor into a swirling storm of thermal white noise. On his display, everything was a solid, blinding wall of flashing red, white, and orange pixels. Their technological advantage hadn't just been neutralized, it had been completely weaponized against them. In less than 10 seconds, the S'valian vanguard had been stripped of their digital eyes, and the hunt had shifted from a clinical cleanup operation back to something deeply primal, ancient, and terrifyingly dark. Chapter 3: The Ghost in the Shafts. Deep within the suffocating, lightless labyrinth of the maintenance shafts that lined the underbelly of the lowly wanderer, a man named Miller sat perfectly still. He was not a young man, nor was he a soldier. He possessed no formal military titles, no shiny medals of valor, and no specialized power armor. He was an asteroid miner, a veteran of the brutal, unforgiving corporate operations in the Jovian belts, where the human race tore precious resources out of giant, frozen chunks of rock in the permanent dark of deep space. For 35 years, Miller had lived and worked in environments that would have killed a S'valian warrior in minutes, spaces where there was no light, no warmth, and where a single mistake meant a silent, lonely death in a vacuum. He knew how to read the language of metal under stress. He knew how to move through zero-gravity maintenance tubes without making a single sound, and he knew exactly how a starship put together with scrap metal could be twisted into a trap. To prepare for the arrival of the boarding parties, Miller had done something that would have struck the analytical S'valian commanders as completely insane. He had stripped down to his basic flame-retardant undersuit and covered every single square inch of his exposed skin, his hair, and his gear in a thick, foul-smelling layer of heavy industrial hydraulic grease mixed with pulverized carbon soot. It was a primitive, messy, and deeply uncomfortable camouflage, but it was incredibly effective. The thick grease acted as a highly efficient thermal insulator, temporarily trapping his body heat beneath its surface and preventing it from radiating outward into the cold air. The carbon soot completely absorbed what little ambient light remained in the ship, turning him into a living shadow that could not be detected by even the most advanced thermal sensors or multi-spectrum visors. He had effectively transformed himself into a ghost, a non-entity on the S'valian tactical displays. In his right hand, Miller held his weapon of choice. It wasn't a plasma rifle or a high-frequency energy blade. It was a massive, 3-foot-long industrial pneumatic wrench, cast from heavy, high-density titanium carbide alloy. It was a tool designed to break loose frozen structural bolts on mining rigs, a solid chunk of metal that weighed nearly 25 pounds and could crush an armored hull plate with a single, well-placed swing. Through the thin, vibrating metal of the maintenance shaft wall, Miller listened to the frantic, metallic scraping of the S'valian vanguard moving through the main corridor just 5 inches away. He could hear the heavy, electronic click-clack of their magnetic boots, the robotic amplification of their panicked breathing, and the frantic, high-pitched chattering of their alien language over their external speakers. They were loud. To Miller, who had spent decades listening to the microscopic vibrations of shifting rock to predict catastrophic mine collapses, these alien soldiers sounded like a freight train roaring through a quiet valley. They had spent so long relying on their advanced computers and HUD overlays to tell them where the enemy was that they had completely forgotten how to use their natural senses. They didn't know how to listen to the air. They didn't know how to feel the subtle shifts in atmospheric pressure that occurred when a door opened or closed. Miller closed his eyes, allowing his pupils to dilate fully in the absolute dark. He took a long, slow breath holding the air in his lungs for several seconds to minimize his thermal output, and then slid forward through the narrow maintenance pipe like a serpent. He knew every inch of this ship. He had built half of the secondary ventilation overrides himself during the last dry dock refit at Ceres Station. He knew that right behind the S'valian Diamond Formation, there was a secondary environmental access panel, a small hatch used to service the primary moisture scrubbers. With practiced, perfectly silent movements, Miller reached out and grasped the release lever of the access panel. He had heavily lubricated the hinges with grease hours before. It slid open without a single click. Through the roiling, freezing clouds of steam and liquid nitrogen, Miller peered out into the main corridor. He was less than 3 feet behind the rear guard of the S'valian Formation, a massive warrior whose heavy, matte black armor plates were already starting to collect a thick layer of white frost from the artificial winter Miller had unleashed upon the hall. The S'valian soldier was panning his heavy plasma rifle back and forth in a frantic, erratic arc, his helmet light cutting uselessly through the thick fog. The alien was breathing heavily, the external exhaust vents on his chest armor spitting out rhythmic puffs of warm, white vapor. Miller didn't hesitate. He didn't issue a dramatic challenge, and he didn't make a sound. He simply stepped out of the access hatch, his bare feet moving silently across the grease-slicked deck plates. He brought the massive industrial wrench up in a wide, powerful arc, utilizing the full core strength of a body hardened by decades of heavy labor under high-gravity mining rigs. The heavy titanium carbide head of the wrench struck the S'valian warrior directly at the base of his elongated skull, right where the heavy helmet interface met the thinner neck articulation plates. There was a loud, wet, sickening crunch as the heavy armor plate collapsed inward, shattering the alien's cervical vertebrae and driving the jagged shards of his own chitinous carapace directly into his central nervous system. The warrior didn't even have time to let out a cry. His body went entirely limp, his plasma rifle slipping from his fingers and clattering against the metal floor. Before the heavy corpse could hit the deck, with a loud, echoing boom, Miller caught it. Using the warrior's own bulk to shield himself, he smoothly lowered the dead weight down onto the padded steel floor plates, minimizing the sound of the impact. He looked down at the dead alien's wrist display. A small, green tactical dot, labeled T-Ren, had just turned a solid, flashing amber, indicating a sudden and catastrophic loss of vitals. Miller smiled, his teeth showing bright white against the thick layer of black carbon soot on his face. He melted back into the roiling steam, disappearing into the dark before the remaining members of the squad could even turn around. Chapter 4: The Paranoia of the Hunt. T-Ren, report, Velka bellowed, swinging his rifle around so violently that his heavy shoulder plates slammed against the corridor wall, throwing a shower of yellow sparks into the darkness. T-Ren, turn on your localized comms override. This is an order. There was no response. Nothing but the flat, empty hiss of static on the squad channel. Squad leader, the point warrior, Zedlar, shouted, his voice cracking with an uncharacteristic note of raw panic. T-Ren's tactical beacon has gone completely offline. His suit status is reading 0 cardiovascular activity. He's dead. How? Velka hissed, his eyes darting frantically across his blinding, pixelated HUD. There was no weapon discharge, no plasma flare, no kinetic impact alarms. Did anyone see anything? Did anyone detect a thermal trace? Nothing, another warrior, Kra, yelled, his armor floodlight panning wildly across the swirling clouds of steam. There is nothing here. The sensors are completely blank. It's just the fog. It's just the steam. Form a defensive circle, Velka commanded, his tactical training screaming at him to re-establish control over the situation. Back to back. Do not let your armor gaps face the open corridor. Cover the ceiling shafts. Cover the floor grates. The remaining 4 S'valian warriors pressed their heavy backs together, their plasma rifles pointing outward into the blinding white fog. They were elite soldiers of the expansion, trained to face massive armored divisions, automated drone swarms, and fortified orbital bastions. But they had never been trained to fight an enemy they couldn't see. They had never been trained to fight a shadow that didn't leave a heat signature, didn't make a sound, and killed with the silent, brutal efficiency of a natural apex predator. Up on the high command deck of the Scourge of Viridia, Commander Caithrax stood perfectly rigid before the main tactical console. The bored, dismissive expression that had defined his features an hour prior had completely vanished, replaced by a tense, hard set of his mandibles. "Explain this," Caithrax growled, his voice low and dangerous as he stared at the primary monitoring screen. "Why has Pod 3 halted their advance? Why have we lost the vital signs of 2nd Vanguard T-Ren?" The primary sensor officer's fingers were flying across the holographic controls, his posture trembling with fear. "Commander, I cannot provide a definitive analysis. The internal telemetry from Pod 3 is highly degraded. The atmospheric composition within that specific section of the human vessel has been altered. The presence of dense liquid nitrogen and superheated steam has created an absolute sensor block. We cannot map the corridor. We cannot track the life signs of the crew, nor can we pinpoint the location of the attacker." "An attacker," Caithrax barked. "You told me there were only 7 fragile, unarmed human civilians on that ship. Are you telling me a single primitive ore miner is dismantling my elite vanguard?" The transmissions from the squad are highly disorganized, Commander," the officer stammered. They are speaking of a ghost, a phantom that moves through the walls." "Ghosts do not possess kinetic mass," Caithrax roared, slamming a heavy, armored fist onto the console, cracking the glass interface. "They are experiencing psychological degradation due to the sensory deprivation of the blackout. Order Pods 1 and 2 to divert from their current objectives immediately. Tell them to converge on Pod 3's coordinates and eliminate whatever primitive pest is hiding in the dark. I want this human ship burned to ash if necessary, but I will not allow my vanguard to be humiliated by a handful of hairless bipeds." Back inside the frozen, mist-choked corridor of the lowly wanderer, the S'valian warriors were beginning to unravel. The ambient temperature had dropped to -60 degrees. The moisture from their heavy breath was freezing instantly upon their helmet visors, forcing them to manually scrape the frost away with their heavy gauntlets just to see 2 feet ahead. "I heard something," Kara whispered through the comms, his rifle trembling in his grip. "Up there, in the ceiling ventilation grate, it sounded like metal sliding on metal." "Hold your fire," Velka ordered. "Do not waste your plasma cells on shadows." But Kara's nerves were completely shattered. A sudden, sharp hiss of a pressure relief valve echoing through the walls was all it took. With a terrified shriek, the warrior unleashed a continuous, blinding torrent of superheated plasma fire directly into the ceiling. The brilliant, blue-white bolts of energy tore through the thin sheet metal of the ventilation ducts, melting the aluminum alloy into white-hot liquid slag and filling the corridor with a deafening, thunderous roar. The intense heat of the plasma fire instantly flashed the surrounding frost into a massive, blinding wave of superheated steam, completely obscuring what little vision they had left. "Ceasefire! Ceasefire, you fool!" Velka screamed, reaching out to grab Kara's shoulder armor to pull him back. But as Velka lunged through the blinding, white-out cloud of steam, his hand closed on nothing but empty air. Kara was gone. He hadn't fallen. He hadn't shrieked. In the brief, half-second window where the plasma fire had blinded the squad, Kara had been silently, violently pulled upward into the melted, jagged hole in the ceiling. "Kara!" Veilka yelled, panning his rifle light upward. The beam of his light caught a terrifying sight. A heavy, metal ventilation grate was hanging open, swaying back and forth with a slow, rhythmic creak. From the dark interior of the ceiling shaft, a thick, steady stream of dark, purple S'valian blood was dripping slowly onto the floor plates, sizzling as it struck the freezing metal. Beside Veilka, the remaining two warriors completely lost their minds. They didn't see an enemy, they saw an invisible, demonic force that was picking them apart one by one like fruit from a vine. "It's not a man," Zedlar screamed, breaking formation and sprinting down the dark corridor toward the direction of the boarding pods. "It's a ghost. The ship is alive. The carbon is alive." "Zedlar, get back here," Veilka roared, but it was too late. The terrified warrior disappeared into the swirling white fog, his heavy, frantic footsteps echoing down the hall before terminating in a sudden, sharp, metallic screech, the sound of an automated cargo elevator shaft opening, followed by a long, fading scream that ended with a distant, sickening crunch far below in the ship's gravity wells. Chapter 5, The Master of the Void. Now, there were only two left. Veilka and his secondary squad leader, a veteran warrior named M'Thok. They stood back to back in the freezing, ruined corridor, the air thick with the smell of ozone, melted metal, and alien blood. The high-intensity floodlights on their armor were beginning to flicker and fade as the intense, sub-zero cold began to drain their primary battery reserves. "We retreat," M'Thok hissed, his voice remarkably steady despite the absolute horror of the situation. "We advance back to the breach point. We reseal the boarding pod and call for orbital bombardment. There is no victory to be found here, squad leader. This is not a ship. It is a tomb." "S'valians do not retreat from primitives," Veilka spat, though his own hands were shaking so violently that he could barely hold his plasma rifle steady. "Look around you, boy," M'Thok snarled, turning his helmet to face Veilka. "Look at the blood on the walls. This isn't a military defense. This is a slaughter. Whatever is hunting us isn't using a strategy we recognize. It's using the environment. It's using our own fear. If we stay here, we die." Veilka looked down at his primary tactical display. The green dots were all gone, replaced by static. The localized comms network was completely dead. He was an officer of the High Expansion, a proud warrior of the hegemony, but as he stood in the freezing, absolute dark of the human ore hauler, he realized with a sickening surge of clarity that none of his training mattered. The Academy had taught him how to conquer worlds, but it had never taught him how to survive a monster. "Very well," Veilka whispered. "Retreat to Pod 3, move out." They began to back down the corridor, their rifles pointed outward, their steps slow and agonizingly deliberate. Every shadow seemed to stretch toward them, every hiss of steam sounded like a predatory growl. They had made it less than 20 meters when a sudden, heavy metallic thud echoed from the darkness directly ahead of them. Both warriors froze, their weapon lights converging on a single spot in the middle of the corridor. The fog parted for a brief, terrifying second, revealing a figure standing perfectly still in the center of the hall. It did not look like a human being. It looked like a creature born from the very core of a dead star. It was completely black, its entire body coated in a thick, glistening layer of industrial grease and carbon soot that seemed to drink the light from their armor lamps. It wore no armor, no helmet, and no high-tech gear. Its face was a mask of dark grease, out of which peered two completely dilated, hollow black eyes, eyes that didn't possess a single trace of fear, anger, or hatred. They were the cold, empty eyes of a creature that had looked into the infinite, lightless void of deep space for 30 years and had become a part of it. In its right hand, the creature held a massive, 3-foot industrial wrench, its heavy head dripping with dark purple blood. M'Thok did not hesitate. With the lightning-fast reflexes of a 30-year veteran, he raised his plasma rifle and pulled the trigger. But before the weapon could fire, Miller moved. He didn't run. He lunged sideways with a strange, low-gravity grace that defied standard infantry physics. He had spent his life jumping between drifting asteroids in zero-G. He knew exactly how to use the ship's low-gravity settings to propel his body with incredible velocity. The brilliant blue plasma bolt tore through the space where Miller had been standing a microsecond before, melting a massive hole in the corridor wall and illuminating the hall in a flash of white light. Before Mthok could readjust his aim, Miller was already inside his guard. The heavy titanium carbide wrench came down like a falling meteor. It struck Mthok's plasma rifle directly on the magnetic containment barrel. The sheer, kinetic force of the impact did not merely break the weapon. It caused the unstable plasma core to catastrophically rupture in a brilliant, blinding flash of localized thermal energy. The explosion tore through Mthok's forward armor plates, throwing the veteran warrior backward onto the deck with a shattered chest piece and a severed primary arm. He let out an agonizing, wet shriek, his body writhing in the grime as his remaining limbs clawed frantically at the floor. Miller did not stop to observe his handiwork. He slid past the fallen veteran and stepped directly into the path of the last remaining S'valian soldier. Second Vanguard Velka stood frozen, his rifle lowered, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps inside his helmet. He looked at the grease-covered human standing less than 3 feet away from him. He looked at the massive, blood-stained wrench. He looked into those wide, dark, dilated eyes. In that single, timeless moment, Velka understood the great error of the S'valian expansion. They had looked at the human race's primitive technology, their fragile bodies, and their lack of natural weapons, and they had assumed they were weak. They had completely failed to understand that technology was not the source of humanity's strength. Technology was a cage. It was a beautiful, comfortable, high-tech cage that the humans had built around themselves to keep the primitive, terrifying monsters of their own evolutionary history locked away. And when you cut the power, when you turn off the lights, and when you strip away the mask of civilization, the cage breaks, and the monster walks out. Miller did not swing the wrench. He simply stood there, staring at Velka through the swirling steam. Slowly, deliberately, Miller raised his left hand and pointed a single, soot-stained finger down the corridor toward the direction of Pod 3. He wasn't going to kill him, he was letting him go. Velka did not need to be told twice. Dropping his plasma rifle into the grime, the last remaining warrior of Pod 3 turned and fled down the dark hall, his heavy boots clattering frantically against the metal as he sprinted toward the safety of the boarding pod like a terrified child fleeing the dark. Chapter 6. The Message in the Dark. 10 minutes later, a single S'valian emergency pod launched from the primary docking bay of the lowly Wanderer, its automated thrusters firing at maximum capacity as it streaked through the void back toward the massive flagship. Inside the pod, Second Vanguard Velka lay curled on the floor, his heavy armor plates discarded, his body trembling with a deep, uncontrollable shock that no S'valian medical drone could treat. His mandibles were broken, his carapace was stained with the blood of his squad, and his mind was completely shattered. Up on the command deck of the Scourge of Viridia, Commander Caithrax stood in absolute, stunned silence as the telemetry data from the boarding operation finally stabilized. Pods 1 and 2 had reached their objectives, only to find the human crew entirely gone, vanished into the endless, unmapped network of maintenance tubes that riddled the old ship. And Pod 3. Pod 3 had been completely eradicated by a single civilian miner who hadn't used a single piece of modern military hardware. "Commander," the primary sensor officer whispered, his voice shaking so violently he could barely speak. "The emergency pod containing Vanguard Velka has successfully docked in the lower bay. He is the sole survivor. The rest of the boarding party is dead." Kathrax did not move. He did not yell. He did not smash any more consoles. The cold, analytical certainty that had defined his entire life had been completely replaced by a hollow, gnawing sensation in the pit of his stomach, a sensation that his species had not felt in 10,000 years. "Fear. Bring the survivors' telemetry data directly to my personal terminal," Kathrax commanded, his voice a low, gravelly whisper. "And order the flagship to break orbit immediately. We are abandoning this sector." "But, Commander," the officer stammered, looking up in disbelief. "A single primitive civilian vessel. We have the primary plasma batteries. We can incinerate them from orbit." "No," Kathrax said, turning his back on the viewscreen where the lowly wanderer sat quietly in the dark. Its engines cold, its hull silent, waiting like a spider in the center of a web. "If we fire upon them, we will only invite their fleet to respond. And if their civilians can do this to my vanguard, I do not wish to meet their soldiers." The flagship's massive sublight engines flared to life, turning the immense warship away from the human ore hauler and propelling it into the safe, predictable expanse of hyperspace at maximum speed. The official military report of the incident would eventually be compiled by Kathrax himself, stamped with the highest level of security classification available to the High Command, and locked away in the deepest vaults of the Hegemony's Central Intelligence Network. It was a document that would eventually be studied in secret by every major interstellar power in the galaxy. A grim warning that would alter the course of galactic diplomacy for centuries to come. The conclusion of the report was written in an uncharacteristically emotional, frantic script, a stark contrast to the clinical, mathematical style that Kathrax had used for his entire career. The warning was absolute, timeless, and carved in the bitter blood of his dead warriors. Never board a human ship when the power is down, for their technology is not their strength. It is merely a cage for the monster within. They are a species that was born in the dark, hardened by the cold, and shaped by 1 billion years of relentless, predatory slaughter on a world that tried to kill them every single day. When the lights go out and the mask of civilization is stripped away, the human does not become a victim. The human becomes the ghost in the carbon, and when the ghost wakes up, it always remembers exactly how to hunt.